Good evening. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law in the state of Connecticut. With me is our co-host, Jane Faherty, who is an advocate and director of the JumpStart program. She'll introduce herself. And our special guest this evening is Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler, who is a neuropsychologist. Jane and I, we are in our fifth year of doing these webinars, and we are part of a community of concerned parents and professionals, and we are still learning how to navigate this difficult time. It all started with the COVID, and it's evolved to where we are now. For the past 4+ years, we've been moderating a series of webinars to address a myriad of issues that have come up in these unprecedented times. And we try to address the social, emotional, educational needs of students with disabilities. What we do here is primarily based upon Connecticut law. We do appreciate others coming from other states and in some cases other countries, but our presentation tonight is based upon Connecticut law. You'll have to check your own local jurisdiction to see if there are any variations on what we're discussing this evening. Jane, I know, let's see, a lot's changed since our last webinar, and we're getting ready for a new administration and continuation of a school year. So what's new with you?
Hi, Lawrence. It's lovely to be here tonight, and thank you, Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler, for being with us this evening. I think that not too much has changed since the last time we met, but we are anticipating that things might change going forward, but we are yet to see what might transpire. But at this time of year, there's been lots of calls with PPT meetings coming up after the most recent evaluations and assessments and the reviews that have gone out to parents. So there's lots of parents out there wanting to understand the progress that their child has made or lack of progress their child has made. So having Dr. Cohen-Sandler here this evening is fantastic, because part of that is about gathering information and understanding the student from a multiple number of perspectives, so we can make sure that they really receive the support that they need, and then develop the goals and objectives accordingly. So IEEs are a topic that come up quite frequently with parents and also with practitioners in districts, but I'm not sure that everybody truly understands what an IEE is, or even the incredible value that they can add. It's an acronym that gets bandied around a lot, but I really don't know that everybody understands the nuances of them and the different types of test and evaluations. So it's great to be here tonight with you both to talk about this topic as we come to the end of 2024. And as you said, Lawrence, we're now entering our 5th year of this webinar series. So I'm looking forward to this conversation tonight. It certainly is a topic that comes up very often and frequently amongst parents and practitioners in districts. So thank you for joining us.
So this evening, we'll be discussing an IEE, which stands for an Independent Educational Evaluation, how to obtain an independent evaluation, the role of a psychologist, or more specifically, a neuropsychologist with assessments, how advocates and attorneys can be of assistance to parents. We'll do our best to answer all the questions that did come in tonight. And speaking of questions, if you do have questions during the webinar, we would appreciate if you would use the Q&A function at the bottom of the computer screen and not the chat function. This webinar is being recorded, and whatever goes into the chat section is recorded, but whatever goes into the Q&A section is not. We have put some contact information, some links to the Connecticut Independent Evaluation Guidelines. It is a publication available on the State Department of Education website, our biographical sketches, and contact information. I do have a disclaimer. The webinar is being recorded, as I mentioned before. A copy of the webinar will be provided to each person who has registered for the webinar. The information in the webinar does not constitute specific legal, educational, or professional advice regarding you, your child, or your child's circumstances, and should not be relied upon as such. The webinar does not establish an attorney-client relationship with Attorney Berliner, myself, a professional relationship with Jane Faherty, the Stamford Jewish Community Center, which is a co-host of the webinars, a professional relationship, a doctor-patient relationship with Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. By signing up, you have agreed to receive future emails about webinars and events from the Stamford Jewish Community Center, the Law Office Lawrence Berliner. The recording is by Zoom, which is a third-party provider and not an agent of or associated with the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner, Jane Faherty, the Stamford Jewish Community Center, Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. And it's, as I mentioned before, it's based upon Connecticut state law and policies and federal law. So if you're coming from another state, you have to check your local jurisdiction because each state has their own special education laws on top of the federal special education law. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, an author, speaker, has written many books, appears on television, and she is also a neuropsychologist, and Dr. Cohen-Sandler will explain the difference between a neuropsychologist and, say, an ordinary psychologist. So we want to thank you for being here, and we'll allow you to add to anything Jane and I have said as far as an introduction.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back again. And this is one of my favorite topics, of course, doing so much neuropsych testing. I get a lot of questions from parents, and so it's a great opportunity for me to speak to a group. And hopefully, when you leave here this evening, you will have just a lot more information at your disposal that'll help you to think through what your kids need and how to provide that for them. So in terms of my training, so I was trained as a clinical psychologist, particularly a child clinical psychologist, but I also the adults. And really from my first days as a graduate student, I started studying neuropsychology. I worked 50% time my first year of grad school, my PhD program at the VA hospital in Washington, D.C. And it sparked a love of neuropsychology that has continued throughout my entire career. And so I've done a lot of postdoctoral training in it. And I find that it's giving me an ability to really look at kids with a much finer lens than doing a psychoeducational evaluation. So what do I mean by that? The difference is with neuropsych testing, I can, let me back up. With psychological testing or psychoeducational testing, you understand kids' cognitive abilities, usually their achievement going on, right? And when you see discrepancies or when you don't know why. And so what neuropsychology does is it helps you to understand wherein lies the problem. Why are these discrepancies existing? And so typical examples of neuropsych testing would be to dig deeper into things like attention and memory and executive functioning and language and motor skills, as just some examples. And so when you do that kind of testing, you really can discriminate one thing from another. And I'll tell you, like here's an example. Probably one of the most common referrals that I get is from parents who say, look, my kid has an IEP or a 504 plan. They've been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. And, they're getting modifications for that. Maybe they have a issue that they might be getting modifications for a different program for that. But the parents say to me, I feel like there's something that we're missing here. It's not telling the whole story. Very, very typical. And a good proportion of the time when I do this deeper testing, I find out that yes, students do have symptoms that fit the criteria for ADHD. But ADHD or ADD turns out not to be the whole story or even the main story. Other neurodevelopmental issues are going on that are really the culprit, like language issues or maybe spectrum issues. And because the focus has been on ADHD exclusively, the other issues haven't been identified or addressed. And so that gives me a great deal of, it empowers me to be able to correct diagnoses or to refine diagnoses. Okay. Do you want me to talk a little bit about sort of how I view my role as
Yes, and I also think it's an important point that you just made reference to, that when if a parent or a set of educators come in with a predetermination that this child is unable to connect, engage because of a diagnosis such as ADHD, your perspective, you're able to say, well, I'm not going to make any assumptions at this point until I've done evaluations, used a variety of tools from which to extract information, and then I can determine whether ADHD is interfering with the child's ability to access the curriculum, or if it's other pieces. So in doing that, when you meet with the family, you meet with a child, how do you decide what tools to access at that point? And once you start this journey, what are the different steps that you take along the way?
Okay, I'm happy to answer all those questions, Jane. I just want to back up a little bit because sometimes parents don't know exactly what an independent evaluation is. And I want to just talk about sort of how I see my role, okay? I am a consultant who was called in either by the school or by the parents, depending who's paying for it, to provide a kind of unbiased, objective viewpoint of why the student is struggling, okay? And what they need to be successful, of course. So sometimes parents and schools agree with the diagnosis, but the issue is that it's how the problem is being addressed or not addressed. Other times, the child appears differently at school and at home. And so I can kind of take a big view and try to understand why that's the case. Sometimes there's a disagreement about diagnoses, but the bottom line is there are unresolved questions about the student that need to be answered so that there's a shared understanding of the student and their needs, okay? And so the first thing that I do is I see myself as providing a kind of fresh look at the student. I don't care how many times they've been evaluated. And of course, a lot of times I see students who have been through so many evaluations, over the course of life. And that's all fine and good. But the first thing that I do is I meet with parents and I talk with them about the child's background, the history, educational history, medical history, social history, emotional history, family history. I want to get a real context for what's going on. I also want to find out from the parents' perspective what they're seeing, and I mean, not just the negative things, but also the positive, like, who is this child? What is this child like to them? What are the child's strengths? Where are they shining? Because that tells me what areas of the brain are working really well, right? And then what they see as the biggest problems. And then I help the parents to formulate some questions that they would like answered by the evaluation, okay? And those questions can be broad, like, is this child in the right educational environment? Could be about the diagnosis. It could be something more specific, okay? But we come up with some questions because I want to make sure that my evaluation is geared toward answering those questions. Every evaluation is different. It's not a generic one-size-fits-all, okay? So what I don't do at the beginning is I don't read anything that's been written by the child. I ask the parents to gather that information for me, that when I'm finished with my evaluation, I have formed my own opinion. Then I can go back and look at the history of what previous school-based evaluations or private evaluations. But I want to see the child with a fresh. And so based on what the parents are telling me about what the issues are, what they're seeing, and where the child is struggling, then I come up with a kind of proposed list of evaluation. I say proposed because I think in many decades of doing this work, it has never remained the same, because as I'm working with students, I'm constantly revising it. I'm thinking, oh, okay, I don't have to look at that anymore. That's going well. But I'm seeing this. So I switch gears and do something else. So it's constantly evolving. And the good news about neuropsychology is that I have such a number of measures to do, and new tests and materials are being developed all the time, which is fantastic. And so I'm able to keep going in my evaluation until I have answered all those questions for myself and for the parent. And then at the end of that, then I get information from other people. Often I speak with therapists or people who are doing remedial work, clinicians, speech and language clinician, or reading teacher. I do then read very carefully what the last IEP has said, minutes of PPTs, what teachers have said, especially if there's a description of how teachers in the classroom. Oftentimes I try to have a one-on-one conversation with case managers or special ed teachers, or whoever's really working with the child. And so my job then is to integrate all this information, like putting together 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and coming up with really a picture of what's making this child tick. And then the parents say to me, okay, is that it? And I say to them, no, I'm not going to say to you, here's what's going on, goodbye and good luck. Then the most important part of the job is for me to translate that information into recommendations, because really my job is to find out what is going to help the student successful, what's going to help them thrive. And that could mean not just in the classroom, but on the playground, or in gym class, or every other aspect of their school experience. So I think that gives you a summary, and if anybody has any more specific questions, I'm so happy to answer them.
Now, your evaluation summarizes the results, and then you make professional recommendations. Is that correct? So we had a question that came in. A parent had an independent evaluation granted for literacy and was wondering if they missed the boat by not asking for a neuropsychologist. And I know I've read one of your reports where you made a very specific recommendation for a literacy evaluation. Is that because there's a limit to what you do as a neuropsychologist in the area of reading, for example?
So what I would say is that I never want to focus too narrowly on one thing, because a student is not just a student, but a person as well. And so in my experience, students who have literacy problems, as let's just say that, often there's a whole host of other things that go into that. How they access their education, how they function, is not just a measure of, let's say, the effectiveness of remediation that they might get, but also it's how they feel about themselves as a learner, how they feel about themselves in the school environment, if they feel accepted by their peers. All of these things have a very important role. And so I would never do just that kind of thing. Now, what you're referring to is that I did an evaluation, and in that evaluation, I determined that this high school student was reading on an elementary school level. Mm. And so what I wanted to do is get much more refined, because we were asking for a lot of things in the district. I wanted to get a reading specialist involved who could really parse that out in a way that only a reading specialist could do. Okay, so part of my recommendation sometimes is for further testing. I do a lot of language testing, but I'm not a speech and language clinician. And so if I think there needs to be a deeper dive, I'll do that. If I think there needs to be a transition evaluation, I'll make a recommendation. If I think that there are central auditory processing problems going on, I refer to an audiologist. So recommendation. Thank you.
We had a question from a parent. Is there an optimal age at which you should complete or request these evaluations? Some parents might feel concerned that they've missed the boat, they've left it too late to find out and explore their child's specific needs. Is there an ideal age for this type of testing?
That's a great question. And I would say that it depends on what the issue is. So in general, I would say that psychologists and neuropsychologists feel that the earlier something is diagnosed and early intervention can be implemented, the better the outcome, okay? And so if a child is showing signs of literacy problems, we're going back to that, like let's say that in preschool, they're having trouble identifying letters or understanding letter-sound relationships, that's something that may want to be tested. I wouldn't necessarily do a full neuropsych evaluation at that age, but I would certainly want to know, is the child able to do what most 5-year-olds can do? And if not, then that's something that they may want a little enrichment about. In general, I find that before age 6, there's so much variability in children's performance that I like to wait until children are at least 6. In psychology, we call that the magic age is 6, where they've had a lot of maturation, these great maturation birth. And then in terms of, is there an ideal age? Again, you know, parents, I think, are often told, oh, everything is fine, everything is fine, everything is fine. And their big regret is that they feel like they just wait and wait. And finally something happens and they think, okay, now we're going to absolutely do this evaluation. And they have regrets that they didn't do something earlier. So I would say to parents, you know, trust your gut feeling. If you feel like something's not quite right, then explore it. And not every person that I see for a consultation ends up getting this evaluation. You know, at least a consultation, I can go over all this material for parents and I can tell them, I'm concerned about this, or I'm not so concerned about this. Why don't we wait and see what happens with this and make a decision at a later date?
And just to add, you know, pediatricians, particularly developmental pediatricians, are a good source of information, especially for the younger child, meaning under that age 6 cutoff. But I would also point out there are preschool measures, the Battelle preschool language sample. There are many, but as Dr. Roni Cohen has pointed out, I think the older the child, the less variability. The younger the child, the more variability. So that doesn't mean don't evaluate it. Just understand there may be more wobble with some of the scores than evaluating an older child. Jane, we're talking about independent evaluations, and I know you do a lot of advocacy work besides your other job at the JumpStart program. What's your experience in obtaining independent evaluations? Because one of our topics is the role of the advocate, the role of the attorney in obtaining independent evaluations, that is.
My experience, it depends upon the district and also the reason for requesting the IEE. So the reason for requesting an IEE is to find out more information about a student from which you can develop appropriate and meaningful goals and objectives and the related services to help ensure that the student masters those goals and objectives. So I would say that the thing to do is that if you feel that the school have completed evaluations and those evaluations haven't really provided you with an adequate amount of information from which to develop an appropriate IEP and goals and objectives and related services, you might decide in consultation sometimes with private practitioners or other personnel outside of the district that you've been working with that you need more information to find out why the student has not mastered goals and objectives or is not making meaningful progress. or is plateauing or indeed declining in certain areas. And it's at those points that you request an IEE because you need more information about this student, specific detailed information about the student, and the practitioners in the district might not have the appropriate resources or education or tools to conduct certain evaluations within the IEE. So it is a request that you make at a PPT meeting. You make that formal request at the PPT meeting, and at that point, they will either agree to move forward with an IEE, or they will decline the moving forward with an IEE, at which point there's other steps that we can take, or you might wish to engage someone such as yourself, Lawrence, at that stage too. But it's the PPT meeting is when you make that formal request for an IEE. When I'm working with clients, it's something that we don't necessarily ask for straight off the bat, depending upon what information we have. Sometimes I need to see what data has already been collected before we immediately request an IEE, because we want to make sure that it explores the right areas for the right reasons. But the PPT meeting is when you make that formal request for an IEE.
And that's what we call the meetings in Connecticut. Other states, they call them CES or IEP meetings. So it's the same type of meeting. It's your official meeting with the school team to discuss your concerns to enhance your child's education. And since we're talking about independent evaluations, I thought I would just digress for a moment. Usually the independent evaluation is preceded by a school district evaluation, an evaluation by a speech and language pathologist, an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, a school psychologist, to name 4 areas, and many other areas. And for the parent that asked about whether the Connecticut alternative assessment system is an evaluation, the answer is yes and no. It's a general evaluation regarding your child's ability to access the curriculum, but it's not the type of evaluation we're talking about. So when the alternative or if any general assessment is administered, that's not covered by the independent evaluation. So if you have a child who's not doing well with the results of the Connecticut alternative assessment, that may require an initial evaluation by the school district. That could be by the school psychologist, the speech and language pathologist, the occupational therapist, etc. It is those types of evaluations that trigger the request for an independent evaluation if the parents disagree with the school evaluation. That's another prerequisite. You have to disagree with one or more of the evaluations. So if you are okay with the speech and language evaluation, but not the school psychologist, then you're going to ask for an independent psychological evaluation. So the person that's asking about the basically the statewide testing, that's not the type of evaluation, but that may cause one to request a referral to special education, a PPT meeting, and signing a consent for a comprehensive evaluation. And that's where the rights under the federal law and state law as well here in Connecticut come into play. The school does an evaluation. The parents have a right to request a publicly funded independent evaluation if they disagree with the school's evaluation. There's often confusion that I encounter even today that parents are only entitled to one evaluation per year. It's one evaluation per subject area per year, not one independent evaluation per year. So if you have a disagreement with the school psychologist, you get one evaluation, but you don't give up the right to an independent evaluation for the speech and language, the occupational therapist, and other evaluations. The school district has 2 choices when a parent make a request for an independent evaluation, and that is yes or no. If they say yes, that means they will pay for the independent evaluation, provided the independent evaluator meets the criteria for outside evaluations. For example, do they have a PhD in clinical psychology, or are they licensed in a particular professional discipline? That's an example of criteria. If the school district denies the request for an independent evaluation, they have to file within a reasonable period of time a request for a due process hearing against the family in order to defend their evaluations. And as Jane pointed out a moment ago, that might be the point in time to talk to an attorney to find out what your rights are, what a due process hearing is. And some parents say, I want to go to the hearing, and some parents say, I can't take a day off from work, or I can't hire an attorney, or I'll figure it out, maybe my health insurance will pay for a portion of the evaluation. The due process hearings are, most of the cases in Connecticut for due process hearings involve school districts filing requests for due process hearings against parents. And most of the parents represent themselves, and most of the time the parents do not prevail, which is just another way of saying they lose. So the parents do not receive the publicly funded independent evaluation. That doesn't prevent the parents from getting their own evaluation, but they're going to have to pay for it. So procedurally, it's important to know what your rights are. And fortunately, in Connecticut, and we've posted it on our chat section of the website, there is a guideline from the State Department of Education that was published in March 2018 on independent evaluation. And there's a lot of very good, useful information in there. There's another topic in the guidelines. It involves in-school observations, but we're just talking about the first section, which involves the independent evaluation.
And I just wanted to make it clear too that when you request an IEE, even if the district agrees, and Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler can attest to this, you don't get the results back the next week or sometimes even the next month. Sometimes these evaluations take a long time to complete for a variety of reasons. And so if you are going to make the request, just know that they do take time to complete. Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler, in your experiences, what might be the approximate timeline that a parent might wait to have the results back from someone such as yourself?
Well, I can answer for myself. I think it's a little different for everyone. I have heard from parents, some parents have waited, like 6 months to a year to get a report, which I think is not okay. That's not the way I work. I'm a little type A. So once I say to parents, I can do this evaluation, usually I start within a week, 3 weeks at the most, if I'm really, really busy. And then really, so parents ask this as well, how often does the student have to come and everything? So it's probably a good moment to talk about this. So after I've spoken with the parents and agree that we're going to do this evaluation, we know the questions that are going to be answered, we set up times when I'm going to meet with the student, and the amount of time for each session is determined by the child's age, maturity, and ability to focus, for example. And so it could range from 1 hour to 3 hours for each session. And one of the questions I know that came in already, and I can address it now, is the length of time or the amount of hours that are spent on each evaluation really varies a lot. And it depends on things like, first of all, the child's age. And the reason for that is that most standardized test instruments have fewer questions for the younger ages. So, testing an elementary school child is going to take less time theoretically than testing a middle school child, and the high school or college student is going to have more items. But then there are other factors like the breadth of the evaluation, the scope of the evaluation, how many of the neuropsych areas will be addressed. Sometimes things are narrower, and other times, for most of the students that I test, it's a very complex profile. And so it's really important to look at all aspects of it. And then the other factor, which is enormous, is really the personality and the working style of the student. Because, some students like to rush through. And of course, my job is to slow them down so I can make sure I get the best performance out of them. But still, they're going to be faster than, let's say, the students who are very perfectionistic, obsessive, or indecisive, who can take much longer. And in my experience, the difference between, one end of the spectrum to another could be 30 or 40%. So it's really hard to predict in advance. But once I do all of the test administration, then I need a little time to do the scoring, the analysis, the interpretation. And then, as I said, I talk to exemplary people who are in the child's life who can provide information. And then I write the report. And my goal is always to try to complete this process by 6 weeks. And it depends, if the child gets ill or if there's a vacation, things like that can interfere. But honestly, when parents come in and they finally make this decision, most parents want it done yesterday. And I understand that, as a parent. So I try to respect that. But it really does vary. Some people, I like to write, so the report writing is a joy for me. For a lot of psychologists, so it just depends.
We had a question come in. Once the independent evaluation is granted, do you schedule the appointment, the school schedules the appointment? And the flip side of that coin is, how are the results communicated to the parents, the school, or both?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so once I am given the green light to go ahead and do an independent education evaluation, my work is with the parent. I communicate with the parents only, and we set up appointment times. We talk about whether we need to modify the amount of time based on what I'm observing, based on what the parents are observing. So it's really sort of a working relationship. And my procedure is that I always, like 100% of the time, meet with parents and give them the feedback before providing any information, regardless of who's paying for it. I just think that that's the way to do it. And then the parents get a copy of the report, and then the school gets a copy of the report.
Is that simultaneous, or you give it to the parents and the school, or you give it to both the school and the parents simultaneously?
Ideally, what I like to do is to give it to the parents first, because again, I work with students who have very complex histories. And even though I'm hopefully listening very carefully, sometimes I make a factual error, like, oh, they started speech and language therapy in 3rd grade, not in 2nd grade, or something like that. And so as a courtesy, and also to be completely correct, I ask the parents if I've made any factual errors. It gives me a chance to correct them before sending the report to the school. But that's generally within 2 days.
So Lawrence, this is a question for you with regard to timelines. In the event that a district denies the parents the opportunity to pursue an IEE, and they are advised that they need to go to due process, how long typically could that process take for a parent, if they are successful at due process hearing, to then have access to an IEE?
Well, there are a couple of subparts to that question. When a parent requests an independent evaluation, the school district, if the school district says no, they have to file for a due process hearing within a reasonable period of time. There's not a prescribed timeline. So some hearing officers and some judges have said 2 to 3 months is reasonable. So if they don't file within 2 to 3 months, then by default, the independent evaluation should be granted. So there's one answer. It may take 2 to 3 months for the school to make a decision on whether to file for a due process hearing. And since this is a limited issue to only whether or not the school's evaluation was appropriate, and if not, whether the parents are entitled to a publicly funded independent evaluation, usually these hearings are 1, maybe 2 days at most. This is not whether the IEP is appropriate, whether the child needs an in-district, out-of-district placement. It's on a very limited issue. So the hearing officer can take maybe 2 weeks after the close of the evidence to issue a written decision. So this whole process may take about 2 or 3, maybe 4 months before we know whether or not a district is responsible for the evaluation. And then you have the timelines that Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler just talked about. I meet with the family, records review, schedule. So this whole process may take months at a minimum from start to finish. And that's why it's important, to try to, intervene as quickly as possible so you can project out whatever timelines you need to make sure you're getting the evaluation if the answer is yes, or being prepared to go to a hearing if the answer is no. So what happens in the meantime to your child, the student? Well, unless you're going to get your own evaluation, pay for it privately, you're going to have to wait for this process to unfold. I would add one additional thing, and that is, if parents do elect to get their own evaluation and pay for it themselves, it's advisable to give written notice to the school district of your intent to obtain that evaluation and a corresponding request to be reimbursed after the fact. So the independent evaluation is a request to ask the school district to pay for the independent evaluation first. And what I just described is an after-the-fact reimbursement.
So
I just wanted to add one thing to what Lawrence had said about the timeline. I think both of you will probably agree with me. So what I find sometimes is that parents feel that, they've seen the summer and they want to see what kids are like at school, and they wait until, the first report card at the end of October, and then they decide they want to have the child evaluated, and they can't find somebody right away. Anyway, what ends up happening is that the results are available in March or April. Meanwhile, most of the school year has gone by, and then they try to schedule a PPP in the spring, which those of us who have been through it know that that's really hard to schedule because everyone else is scheduling it then. And so it's very frustrating for parents to go through this process, and then it's not applicable, that what's learned cannot be applied in the school year. Sometimes they can use that information over the summer. We make use of that time to start working on things, but it is frustrating.
Absolutely. And we had a question here saying, do districts typically provide a list of approved evaluators, or can families choose their own evaluators? So my experience when I've done this, it's been that the school districts have provided a list of evaluators. But what's interesting, when you do receive that list of evaluators, the devil is sometimes in the details. So the list might just be an organization or a group that complete evaluations. And if you book an evaluation with somebody within that practice, that individual within that practice might not meet the criteria that the school district have. So even sometimes finding a practitioner from the list provided by district can also take a period of time to complete as well. So none of this is a quick fix. And so I just think when you go into this experience, you have to know that it's going to take time to maybe arrange for the evaluations to take place, and even find a practitioner that is available to complete those that meet the criteria established by your school district. And throughout all of this period of time, the student is then functioning upon the existing information regarding them within the district, not the new information that you're going to receive. So know that there might be a lag, a significant lag in terms of appropriate goals and objectives created to meet the child really where they are at. None of this is a quick fix.
I want to
if I may, just to expand upon, this also came in as a question, Jane. When a school district gives a parent a list of evaluators, those are suggested evaluators. The school cannot compel you to use those evaluators if you have somebody else in mind. There's one school district that I deal with that has a list of proposed evaluators, and about 3 or 4 of them were people I would make referrals to. So I advise my clients, since these people are already approved by the district and they work for you and the school will pay, go with them. That way we don't have to get a resume or a CV or explain to the school district. And sometimes the school district, has an inside track on getting an appointment sooner rather than later. So sometimes there are advantages to using a list of approved evaluators suggested by the school district, and sometimes there are disadvantages. I have one evaluator, a retired school psychologist who works, gets a lot of referrals from the former employer, and I have serious concerns with the quality of the evaluations. But but I do this on a case-by-case basis. So it's important to know, talk to the evaluator, do some research, due diligence before agreeing to a particular evaluator suggested by anybody, let alone a school district. I apologize. Roni, you want to say something?
I totally agree with what you just said, that it's so important to, when you're looking for an independent evaluator, to really do your diligence and don't assume just because they have a PhD that they're going to do the kind of breadth and the kind of diligence that you want them to do. What is their philosophy about testing? How do they determine what tests to give? How quickly can they provide the report? Do they make recommendations? They make specific recommendations. Most importantly, a lot of neuropsychologists, the way they're trained, they do the cognitive and the achievement testing, but they don't do the social and emotional piece. And this is really important, because what I find, and this is, I think this is a little bit of how an independent evaluation and a school-based evaluation can differ, is that the school might focus on a particular learning disability or a neuroatypicality like autistic spectrum disorder, and they focus on the academic need. But parents feel that the whole child is not being considered. The child may be miserable in school and very anxious or depressed because they're dealing with a noisy cafeteria, or they can't manage the hallways, in passing time, or gym is a nightmare for them. And that's not something that the schools generally look at or care about. Is what parents care about. So really ask these questions. And the other thing is, lately, I've been getting requests from school districts that I haven't had a relationship with before, like 3 new ones. And, but I guess someone had given the parents my name, and so they recommended me. And the school district, it wasn't that big a process. They called me, they asked me questions about how I work, about what my credentials are. I emailed them my CV, and they said, fine. It was not a huge deal. So don't feel like you have to do exactly what the school is suggesting. Take your time and really find someone that you're comfortable with.
Very important that you and your child have a collaborative, trusting working relationship with the evaluator. And Dr. Roni mentioned that sometimes students have been evaluated, up and down, and the last thing they want is another evaluation, even if with a private evaluator. So it's very important that personalities and other things mesh before making that commitment. We did get a question about cost of evaluations. And since the school districts are paying for the evaluation, they can impose reasonable costs, but they have to have an exception built into their policy. I had a case a number of years ago where the school district put a $2,500 cap on a neuropsychological evaluation. And I didn't know any neuropsychologist east of the Mississippi River that would do a neuropsychological evaluation for $2,500. So I had filed a complaint with the State Department of Education saying the cap, without exceptions, was illegal. Rather than deciding the merits of my complaint, the State Department of Education urged that district to grant an exception to their policy, and I was able for that family to get a neuropsychological evaluation for considerably more than $2,500. But they are permitted to have reasonable cost caps, provided there are exceptions, because there may be some compelling circumstances as to why the cap on evaluation should be exceeded.
So here's a question we got in tonight too. Are there certain diagnoses where a developmental pediatrician would be preferable over a neuropsychologist as an evaluator, or vice versa?
I think that the answer to that is probably yes. And I would agree with what Lauren said before about the fact that when children are very, very young, under 3, the great thing is that with a developmental pediatrician, parents don't have to guess. Like they may never have had a child before. It's maybe their first child, or this child may be developing differently from their older child or children. And because the developmental pediatrician has seen thousands of children, they can, I think, much more readily by observation and by history, know when something is a red flag, and can then, I think that they're good as gatekeepers too. They might refer for further testing, or they might say, let's watch this and see what develops. In my experience, it's been very, very helpful and reassuring to parents. If it's
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I realized I didn't say that's for very young children. For children who are school age, I think that when it comes to something academic or social, something like that, where you might want to have a clinician observe the child at school in the class, or on the playground, or something like that, that's when a clinician might be more appropriate.
We had a couple of quick questions. One or both I'll handle. If a child has a Section 504 plan and not an IEP, an individual education plan, are they entitled to an independent evaluation? The general answer is no, because the regulations under Section 504 differ considerably than the regulations under the federal special education law. But that doesn't leave a parent without a remedy. You can certainly request a referral to special education and request an initial evaluation of the child's suspected or actual disabilities at that point in time. And if you disagree with the outcome of the initial evaluation, that would allow a parent to request an independent evaluation. And for the other family that said, well, my child doesn't have a diagnosis from a doctor, these are not medical conditions. The definition of a child with a disability, quote, these are legal definitions. In other words, a learning disability is not a medical diagnosis. Autism is not a medical diagnosis. Emotional disability is not a medical or psychiatric diagnosis. These are legal definitions. So if you have a diagnosis from a doctor, that's good. That's a starting point. But if you don't, you can still request a referral to special education, request a comprehensive evaluation, and you will determine whether or not your child meets the criteria for a, quote, child with a disability, and if so, whether they would benefit from an IEP. In Connecticut, we have 14 categories of disabilities. A child only has to meet one in order to be eligible. And if they're eligible, we'll discuss an IEP. If the child is not eligible, you have what are called procedural safeguards. Those are your rights. And one of the many rights is the right to request an independent evaluation.
We did get a question in earlier before the webinar started. If a child has been identified as having PAN symptoms, would it be appropriate to complete a neurological evaluation of that child?
I actually just did that. I just completed an evaluation of a 13-year-old. I'm going to be meeting with his parents this week. And he is one of the more complex profiles I've seen. And PANS is part of that picture. And so, yes, it's absolutely, because it's only a part of the picture. And just like any other medical condition, I mean, when I talked before about getting background information, sometimes I see children who have genetic defects or other kinds of medical problems. And that's, of course, very, very important information that I integrate into my formulation of what's going on. In this case, I did research because I wasn't, not that up on PANS. I did some research, and what was important, I think, what is important is to understand the timeline of when the PANS occurred, and usually it's subsequent to a strep infection. And so did the child exhibit any of the symptoms, any of the PANS symptoms prior to the onset? And then after, has there been any abatement of the symptoms? And so in this case, the child had a lot of those symptoms before, still has them. And my feeling is that in a case like this, you can't determine for sure whether or not, what is causing these symptoms, right? It could come from this child is on the autistic spectrum, so some of those symptoms, anxiety and obsession, are part of that. It's not important sometimes to determine what is causing it, but it is important to really understand what the symptoms are and how they're affecting the child every single day in school, and to address those issues so that the child can thrive.
We had a question come in: is dysgraphia an issue? How is it assessed? Is it there a diagnosis? Do schools have to do something beyond assistive technology? And that reminded me, I read one of your reports where you included a handwriting sample, and that handwriting sample, as they say, a picture tells 1,000 words. Well, that handwriting sample, you had a lot to say about that. Could you answer that one?
So actually, as an independent evaluator, I'm not beholden to whatever state criteria are for different things. I can take a much broader view. But it happens that dysgraphia is one of the learning disabilities that are included under IDEA. And it's also diagnosed in the DSM-5, which is, of course, the psychiatric handbook of diagnoses, which is a specific learning disorder affecting written expression. And so dysgraphia is a broad term that means literally difficulty with writing. And it can be handwriting, and that's because of poor graphomotor, meaning pencil control, or it can have broader effects. So sometimes dysgraphic kids have a really hard time putting their thoughts down on paper. They have difficulty organizing their thoughts. Maybe they'll put them down on paper, but it'll be a big jumbled mess. Other times, almost always, they have problems with spelling and also with spatial aspects of spacing in between letters. In between letters of words, or in between words in a sentence. And so all of these things have to do with their ability to express themselves on paper, right? And also the legibility of their work. So one thing I want to talk about for 1 second here, because it's a very common question, is, can we remediate a child's handwriting? As a parent of an adult child with dysgraphia, let me say, no, absolutely not. It's just, first of all, even if it were effective, the amount of time, the tedious time that it would take to do is really ridiculous, because you want your child to be, getting the other help that they need, or engaging in lots of wonderful, constructive activity. So in other words, I'm saying it's a waste of time. However, what can be done here is, if it's affecting the written expression, the ability to express the child's thoughts on paper, if it's affecting mechanics, such as handwriting and spelling and spacing and things like that, the school can definitely create an IEP, and the child can get support in any of those areas. This is a frequent thing that I get, and I have a whole section that I write about, and I call it relief from dysgraphia, not remediation, but relief from dysgraphia. And so it doesn't only have to include things like technology. It can include modifications, such as the fact that sometimes when children take tests, and they have to fill out bubbles, or they have to write in booklets, that's really, really difficult for them. And so it's better if they have a different sheet of paper. Or you might have a child, my son started taking notes on a little PDA. So like the first PDA that ever came out when he was 13. That's how he took notes. He couldn't do it by hand. You might have all sorts of things. You might have a teacher working with a student to help them use graphic organizers before they start writing. So it can be, the intervention can be at any point in this process, or if it's just a matter of handwriting, the good news is, in the age of technology, there's no reason why kids have to struggle. They can just do, computer.
Absolutely. And having an adult child myself who has appalling handwriting, but they find that by taking notes that it actually helps them understand and process information, but they then struggle to read back that information because it's so disorganized. There are applications now that you can use a pen, you scribe it, but then afterwards it will convert that into text. And then the student, if they have the capability and ability, they can then look at the font version of the handwriting that they can read. So technology does have a role to play, and quite often when you're looking at evaluations, don't forget that we can supplement some things and enhance some experiences through technology, but not to necessarily limit your students' experience to the technology available within district. Sometimes if you educate and inform yourself about other technologies that are available out there and go to some specialists outside of the districts welcome sometimes the expertise and knowledge coming in, because things evolve and move very rapidly within this field, and there might be other pieces that they haven't had the opportunity to explore before that can be introduced for your child.
It kind of reminds me, many years ago, I had asked a psychologist, why is it I feel like I learn better when I'm writing than listening? And then she called it kinesthetic learning. I said, what's that? He said, it's the friction of the pen. You're inputting data through one of the 5 senses, or 6 senses, as some people say. And that's why you input data better if you are writing than if you're just listening. We're getting close to our ending hour, but when we were going over the list of questions, we had a very unusual one that came in, and Dr. Roni Cohen has offered to address that. That was about, remember the one on credibility associated with evaluations? Do you remember that?
The question was, what are things in the IEE that might influence credibility? And the specific question was with an administrative law judge or hearing officer. And I would like to broaden, since I don't know anything about administrative law judges or hearing officer, I'm going to answer the question based on my experience of whether school districts will accept what you've written and have respect for it, or try to discredit it. Okay. Now, sometimes it's not happened to me very often, but there are 2 bad memories that I have where literally they were just determined to discredit everything. Like things like, well, maybe the student was anxious when you evaluated this. You're not anxious in school, that kind of thing. No. But in general, what I want to say is that, and this is important when choosing, because you want to present yourself as a professional who has respect for other professionals and wants to be collaborative. And I think that's so important to go in there with thinking, we're going to work together. Like, assume that they're going to want the best for the kid, hope for the best, and present yourself like that. And so I think it's important to not go in there thinking you know better than the school. Get information from the school. Include them in the process. Let them feel heard. Speak to, as I said, the SPED teacher, the case manager, or whomever, and include that information. Obviously, you're going to do this with a lot, but don't make wild claims. Make sure that whatever you say is backed up by data. And when I was in my training many, many moons ago, I was taught that you never use just one test. You have to confirm things by more than one test to make sure that it's not a spurious finding. And you want to make sure, and this is hard sometimes, you want to make sure that the tone of your evaluation is respectful of the child, of the parent, and not judgmental. And lastly, you don't want to make recommendations that are so unreasonable and impractical. You want them to be doable and practical. And I think if you come at that, at least in my experience, they're much more likely to accept the results of the evaluation, and even think that they're helpful and they're appreciative. They want to use it to help this.
I completely agree. I recently advocated for a student, and before I went into the PPT meeting, I obviously read the reports, the evaluations, the progress reports, IEPs. But what I also like to do if I have an opportunity is to meet with that child, whether it's from an observational perspective. I had the opportunity to observe one student in an academic setting, and then I can take that information into the PPT meeting with me. So when I'm talking to their teachers or their educational team, I can do it for my own anecdotal observations as well, and really work and come at it from an understanding of how they might be approaching the child, but also give other suggestions as to some strategies that I've seen possibly work or could be tweaked. So collaboration, I think, is the key, and clear, concise, and timely communication with the district as well to resolve these issues. As you mentioned, Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler, Lawrence and I say this all the time: if you have that intuition as a parent that something isn't quite right with your student, the child, or the information that the district are relaying to you doesn't quite marry up with what you're seeing or feeling yourself as a parent, don't sit upon that, but actually act upon it and ask questions. And it's through asking the questions you can elicit more information from which to make a decision from.
That's excellent advice. Trust your instincts, trust that little voice in the back of your head. Parents are a very important source of information. You don't have to have a PhD in any professional discipline or a medical degree to have a feeling that something is not adding up with your child's education. They're not generalizing skills, or or they're not learning in the first place, let alone generalizing skills to home or the community. So we want to wrap up at this point in time. We apologize if we did not get to everybody's questions tonight, but we do our best to answer as many questions, and we hope this information was beneficial to all of our participants. So thank you for joining us and for your tremendous response to our webinars. For those who keep asking, you will get a copy of tonight's webinar, and I think a copy will be posted on YouTube as well. Our next webinar is January 28th, and at that time we will be having a topic, setting the stage for understanding dyslexia. And our guest that evening will be Suzanne Bailey Rice, who is certified in the field of Orton Gillingham. one of the reading programs. She is an evaluator, and she will discuss dyslexia. So we appreciate getting your questions if you plan on registering for that webinar. If you found this evening's webinar informative, we hope you'll register the next one. We have the YouTube channel I had mentioned before, which has the previous webinar recordings. I want to especially thank Dr. Cohen-Sandler for taking time out of her schedule this evening, and Jane Faherty the same. I also want to thank my daughter, Rachel, who's to my off camera, to my immediate right, because without all the efforts that she does to put these webinars together behind the scenes, the registration, operating the computer off camera, this would not happen. We're in the holiday season, so we hope people will have a safe, enjoyable holiday season, and we will see you next month. So Jane and Dr. Roni Cohen, those are my concluding remarks. I hope you'll add yours.
It's been a real pleasure to see everybody this evening, and thank you, Dr. Roni Cohen-Sandler. This has been a very valuable topic of conversation, and I hope you come back to share more of your knowledge and expertise, as we didn't get to answer all the questions tonight. I just want to wish everybody a safe and happy holidays and an enjoyable time for the rest of the year. We hope to see you in January, so we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good night.